Yes, let's just pretend that I don't know anything about America for today, I think, if that's all right with you. If I could just say that there might be an emerging pattern across the three of our papers, and I'll leave it to Leah to sort of seal the deal. It might be that we're identifying ways in which practical theology is a discipline that needs discipline. But I'll just leave that open now, see where that takes us. And also just to say, in responding to this question, what is the future of practical theology, I'd like to offer less prognostication and perhaps a little bit more something shaped by hope. But that might not be what you're expecting, so let's go ahead and give it a try here. I think I'd like to suggest that, at least for me, in thinking about the future of practical theology, the first thing that I want to do is to look at the past of practical theology and sort of seek if we can consolidate a little bit of what's been driving us in our reflections in this area. And so I'm going to look at some of the critiques that have been driving practical theology and theological ethics, I think, in public theology in many ways. And I'll look to the sort of standard cast, that is MacIntyre and Hauer-Wass and Milbank, and just sort of revisit some of those critiques that are actually getting quite old now in some ways, after Virtue's 1984, and just see whether there might be some things there that we weren't expecting, and see where that might take us in terms of opening up where we might be trying to take practical theology in the 21st century. So let me start with MacIntyre and his critique of the ideology of expertise. MacIntyre's critique of social science is quite a sharp one, and this is predicated on his argument, which he develops in After Virtue, that social sciences aim to, and to quote MacIntyre, explain specifically social phenomena by supplying law-like generalizations which do not differ in their logical form from those applicable to natural phenomena in general. So, in MacIntyre's view, social science is constructed in such a way that it works in parallel to natural science, and that this makes it the perfect foot soldiers of managerial expertise, which itself aspires to bring together value neutrality and manipulative power. Those are MacIntyre's words. He goes on to appraise that the salient fact about those sciences is the absence of the discovery of any law-like generalizations whatsoever. Given that the fundamental pathology of social science is its project of creating, and this is MacIntyre's words again here, project of creating a wholly or largely predictable organization, committing to creating a wholly or largely predictable society, this fundamental enterprise in MacIntyre's assessment is doomed. So much like the Enlightenment project fails, this social scientific project is doomed. And according to MacIntyre, this is not an original enterprise either. In many ways, the exaltations of social science for bureaucratic purposes is not unique to the 20th century, but is really just a mirror of what we already had in the 18th century. We're just recapitulating things which didn't quite get laid to rest. What I think is interesting to note, and perhaps not fully appreciated about MacIntyre's critique, is that he's criticizing social science, shall we say, with a capital S, but then there are these occasional sort of affirmations, indirect affirmations of social science with a lowercase s. And this comes in After Virtue, just to give you an example of this, when he says that there's nothing paradoxical in offering a prediction, vulnerable in the way that all social predictions are, about the permanent unpredictability of human life. Underlying that prediction is a vindication of the practice and of the findings of empirical social science, and a rebuttal, and here, of course, he gets back to his critique, of what has been the dominant ideology of much social science, as well as the conventional philosophy of social science. So it's important to note, at least when we're reading MacIntyre, that this is a limited critique about a particular kind of social science practice with particular prejudices regarding objectivity and power. Okay, so let's fast forward just a wee bit to Milbank, and I'll skip Hauer-Wass, I think, just for the sake of time, and just give you Milbank's critique. And again, I'm just going to very quickly recapitulate, so please don't beat me up for summing up someone who's very hard to sum up. Milbank's chief argument, I think we could say, is against the notion of the secular, and more sharply against the idea that social scientific inquiries can effectively, and in his words, police the sublime. The basis of this critique is one that Milbank shares with a number of other political theologians, namely that there is no possibility of a neutral vantage point, which is not itself theological. So Milbank argues for a mode that is, as the subtitle of his famous book suggests, beyond secular reason. One which refuses to allow these positivist theologies to maintain the profile of a transcendent purity. Instead, Milbank wants to commend the possibility of a reversed theology as social science, where religious persons and their practices are not merely the subject of curiosity, but themselves might provide a matrix for interpreting the data of the world. So much like MacIntyre, I think Milbank is fundamentally open to the idea of looking at description as a mode of theological reasoning, but also much like MacIntyre and Hauerwas, he never actually does this in practice. So what I want to open up is the possibility that there has been a profusion, I think, of Heather, as Heather suggested, lived theology or ethnography in the wake of this, which is a way of looking at very close, kind of telescopically, at the community of practice, at lived religion in context. But what we haven't seen really is any kind of modification of the quantitative regime. So we have the sociology of religion sort of fumbling along on its own. I think Robert Wuethnow's critique in Inventing American Religion has created a lot of interesting conversation about this. But what I want to ask is, what about quantitative research? I realize I'm taking us in a slightly different direction than we were just going a moment ago. But if we take Milbank's suggestion that we can actually take ourselves as a matrix for interpreting the data of the world, why must that data only be ethnographic and grounded? Is it possible that we could explore triangulating this kind of research in different ways? Now, I think in each of the cases with Milbank, Hauerwas, and MacIntyre's critique, we find fundamentally a critique of positivism, a critique of the bureaucratic regime, and the way in which we can serve as the sort of foot soldiers of politicians. Having met some politicians, I'm not sure if that's actually the dynamic on the ground anymore, but that might be a matter for another discussion. But essentially, what we're talking about is a mode of dogmatics which is descriptive, not hostile to systematic reflection, but which can perhaps act in cooperation with it. Now, what I want to highlight here is the way in which, at the same time that Hauerwas and Milbank and MacIntyre are launching this critique of quantitative modes of research and these kind of large sample modes of research, we've got a very similar critique happening within secular social science. So I'm not actually sure if we need to juxtapose ourselves against the discipline of social science, that is to say that practical theology and social science are these two sort of battling it out, but that there is this battle between qualitative and quantitative, and I'm wondering if the battle perhaps is actually over, and if the qualitative side has won. I realize this is slightly counterintuitive. I can talk about the science wars, which happened in the 80s and the 90s, and Alan Sokal did this sort of famous seminal article in Social Text in 1996, and then a year later followed up with another article indicating that his qualitative social scientific study was in fact fabricated. So this was meant to sort of humiliate his qualitative peers. And this launched about 2 decades of sort of lobbying back and forth between people in politics and sociology and anthropology and so on. So I think this sort of lobbing bombs back and forth across the qualitative-quantitative divide has been going on all over the place for quite a while now. I think within practical theology we do surveys mostly, and we work a little bit with census data, but it's roughly the same battle. So I think it's generally safe to say that the science wars have not yet concluded. We get lots of polemically oriented volumes and conferences and whatnot still, but I think one of the most significant things that's happened on a social level is this complete lack of trust among the general public in data. This is one of the things that Wuethnow highlights in his study. When you poll people about polls, the major social shift now is that people no longer believe the results of polls. We're still churning them out at this fantastic rate, but generally, and this is where we get strange phenomenon in America, I wasn't going to talk about it, but we may as well, where we have fake news is a phrase now, and what's that all about? Well, that's about mobilizing this distrust in the social scientific enterprise and its ability to reveal the world in a truthful way. So what I want to suggest actually is that this actually shows us that quantitative research is very much on the wane. It might even be that it will lose this battle going back and forth. And so looking on the battleground, as we may, what I'd like to suggest is not that one will win and the other won't, and that we should make something of that, but rather that if we are ascending, we qualitative researchers, and I would count myself among ethnographers on that, the most dangerous scholar in the room is often the person who has been fighting their corner as an underdog for so many decades and fails to recognize the point at which they suddenly represent the majority intellectually. So I wonder if this is a good, if slightly early point at which to consider whether and how to react to the rise of popular and scholarly skepticism towards scientism. What should be our way forward in the wake of that? And I'm going to only suggest this as a suggestive coda, because I've just got a couple of minutes left. But what I want to suggest is that the way forward is not doubling down on our qualitative modes. The way forward may involve doubling down on our theological research and raising the profile of that, I think is Heather suggested. But what if we were to start thinking of ourselves as proper mixed mode researchers? What would that actually look like? And how then could we think about triangulating quantitative research with qualitative and theological research? What would that actually look like? So I'm just going to throw out, like a bomb, a proposed agenda which you can react to and hate, but just to explore what would it actually look like if we just dived right back into data and started doing more than just looking at surveys and censuses, but really sort of jumped into the quantitative game as it's constructed right now, which would be probably participating in this enterprise of big data. So I'm going to suggest 3 possible ways that we might want to think about doing this engagement if we choose to do it at all. If we can strip back some of the capitalistic entanglings which vex this enterprise at present, I think that big data can provide an unexpected element which can help to triangulate grounded results and bottom-up theology. Let us keep in mind that quantitative data is not inert, but an active agent in the process of triangulation, so we should take some care and selectivity in the ways that we engage it. But certainly an approach to mixed-mode research will involve the continued and intensified concern with ethical issues around the craft of consent, sampling, normalization, accuracy, all the bread and butter stuff. But I'd also like to suggest that embracing concern about these things would do much to rehabilitate the reputation of practical theology as an experimentally serious form of scholarship. So time will only permit me a brief elaboration of my 3, but I'm going to give them to you now, and then I'll just explain a few things about what they might look like. So first, surveillance is something that we need to be aware of as a horizon. The second thing is algorithms and analysis. And the third thing is consent. So let's just take consent and surveillance together so that I can be expedient about this. I'm at 12 and a half. Can I have one more?
Yeah, sure.
Grand. So I think 20th century modes of research worked with a face-to-face encounter with a research subject, whether it was in a phone interview, a face-to-face interview, or a survey. It was possible to seek informed consent in this configuration. I think the new horizon in terms of data doesn't actually hold that up meaningfully in a way anymore. And actually, informed consent was never really anything but a disingenuous enterprise to a certain extent anyways. So I think if we're going to avoid doing what James Scott calls seeing like a state, what we need to do is to start pursuing participatory modes of research as a matter of theological necessity. And I think if practical theologians were leading a vanguard in terms of participatory research, we could do quite a lot to teach the social scientific enterprise more generally. But I don't think we're doing that quite yet. Now, to take the matter of algorithms and analysis, the other issue here, I think, is that there's a bizarre and increasing reliance on black boxes to analyze data. So it's no longer a person sitting with a pencil and spreadsheets. Now it's a person writing an algorithm and sort of throwing it out into the wild and hoping it will render interesting insights. And stockbrokers are doing that as much as political scientists. But I think we need to think very carefully about what we're going to do with machine learning and algorithms and this amazing technical prowess that we suddenly have. And I would be worried if theologians suddenly stumbled upon machine learning, got too excited about the tool, as we often do, and didn't really think about the consequences of engaging with it. I think one way of getting around this is to think about open sourcing our data, open sourcing our modes of research, and presenting the content of our algorithms or our survey methods, the mess of data, in the clear light of day, so that people can reproduce our results, they can think along with us, they can criticize us robustly, and we can set up a type of enterprise which is open to inquiry, especially if it's closing down increasingly every day in terms of the modes of the ways that we're doing it. So I'll leave it there, but I think if we're going to do this, and I'm not saying that necessarily we should, but if we do, we're going to need to think about surveillance, algorithms, and consent. And I'll leave it to my colleague to take us in another direction.